Okay, so now we move on to inclusion from the front line, and we're going to hear some honest reflections from two people who will have been helping many of these leaders you've heard from this morning in their journey, and that is Dawn Hurst, who is CEO of EA Inclusion, and Loraine Martins, who is Director of Diversity and Inclusion at National Rail. Dawn has probably got the most descriptive and interesting CV I've seen of all of the speakers this morning, with some fantastic words in. She's a global influencer. She's the author of Financial Return on Inclusion Methodologies, a thought leader with a people-centric approach to inclusion, strong sense of purpose, committed common sense approach, and a disruptor who wants to maximise all that we can from neurocognitive and characteristic difference that it has to be offered. So, and I know that's all true because I know Dawn. So that's a fantastic introduction to her, and also she's going to be in conversation with Loraine Martins, as I mentioned, from Network Rail, and Loraine is Director of Diversity and Inclusion there, and of course Network Rail, a huge organisation, 42,000 employees, fastest growing railway network in Europe. Loraine has oodles of experience in this space, because prior to that she was also involved in the team delivering equality and inclusion and employment and skills for the Olympic Park for London 2012. Again, massive project. So Lorraine's been doing a lot of this at scale, for which she was awarded an MBE. And in October 19, she was in the top 100 women influencing engineering in the UK. Of course, engineering plays a hugely important part in the activities of the energy sector. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you two to take charge of the rest of this session. Listen intently. So it's lovely to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Loraine. And good to speak to you all today. Loraine and I had a conversation about how best to use the 10 or 15 minutes we've got, and we thought it would be really interesting for us to do a bit of a broader reflection on 2020 so far. So I'm going to hand over to Loraine in terms of what's 2020 been like for you. An interesting year, I guess.
I think you might be on mute, Loraine. Oh, sorry, we're still having trouble hearing you, I think.
I think it might be the mute on your computer. Do you want to try that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, fantastic. Hello. Sorry, you're going to have to start that one again. You've disappeared. Oh, there you go. You're back.
Thank you. So what I'm saying was, when we started the year, we didn't anticipate a global lockdown, which has transformed the way that Network Rail has been operating. We also didn't anticipate the disparities of COVID-19 on vulnerable communities, in particular Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and nor did we anticipate the tragic events of the death of George Floyd, and then the global response to that. And all of that in terms of diversity and inclusion has had a massive impact on our area of work, both in terms of the attentiveness of big organisations now towards diversity and inclusion. We haven't had that level of focus before, so that's been a really interesting thing. And also, I guess, the changes in how we work. So people working from home using the technology, learning how to use mute or not, you know, really delivering and still doing stuff from home. And it was really interesting to listen to what John was talking about in terms of stuff around flexible working. So yeah, a roller coaster year, still a bit to come, I imagine. But no, these are things we hadn't anticipated at all. What about you? How's it been for you?
Yeah, it's been fascinating, to be honest. Like you say, suddenly having to learn technology, it has been fun. But yeah, I mean, we usually work globally, so it's been fascinating to see how different countries have reacted to this. It's been fascinating to see that a lot of organisations, fortunately, have focused on understanding that measuring and monitoring. So we've been inundated with lots of audit work and all of that good stuff, really using the return on inclusion methodologies. But I think in terms of the impacts, it's been, as you say, some of those disproportionate areas that have had the biggest impact, you know, disability, women undoubtedly, you know, without even going into the gender pay gap discussion again, today, in terms of the impact that's had, and also how that's affected women being furloughed or redundant, or all of those, sadly, those real life challenges right now. But I think it's been a year to focus on audit and education and building up awareness, particularly around some of the basics like terminology. What have you been doing?
We've had some really great conversations around, particularly around race, but also it's broadened out to lots of kind of discussions about how we are as an organisation and what our values are. And we've rolled out a series of conversations called Let's Talk About Race, which have enabled us to have those discussions, which I don't think we would have been able to reach the breadth of audience that we have been because of the technology. That's been really great. And each of us, we've got employee resource groups, and they've been facilitating some really great discussions about how we can improve our organisation, how we can retain the learning that we've got from being in lockdown and operating differently. And all of those things augur quite well for the future. So it's been a really great time for us to focus on things like mental well-being and mental health, thinking about how we respond to domestic abuse in our organisation and what kind of support we can offer to our people. And there was a campaign that offers people getting away from domestic abuse free train travel. So that was a really great industry response. I think it's afforded us an opportunity to kind of do the best that we possibly can in really quick ways, and I'm immensely proud of some of the efforts that we've made. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, very similar, really good stuff. I think there was a few weeks of paralysis where nobody really knew what they should be doing or how to address it. But I think after 4 or 6 weeks, everybody got really focused. And I have to say, this year's been unprecedented in terms of not only media coverage, which is therefore prompting response from organisations, but certainly, you know, in terms of the amount of people who are using that measure and manage mantra to be able to look at these real quality tools as opposed to gimmicks in terms of their organisations. But it was really interesting, Loraine, when we spoke off camera about what the challenges had been and what still frustrated us. And we were both talking about everybody's focus still on unconscious bias, and that no matter how hard we try, we're not going to eliminate that. We can simply manage it. So it was quite interesting that we'd both encountered that this year, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think what heartened me with our conversation, Dawn, was the fact that we talked about the need to be inclusive leaders, and that the behaviours that you need when you're conscious of your biases and when they kick in is more important than just having the titillation of understanding that we're all biased. So I think, you know, it was permission to recognise your biases, but not permission to behave, to continue behaving in those ways, have an adverse effect on others. And I think that's what the unconscious bias training does in isolation. If it's not located squarely in the kind of behaviours that you need from your leaders, and that's the kind of mantra that we've been giving our colleagues who are all like, you know, they want to fix something and they think, oh, we know about unconscious bias, it's going to be remedied. Oh no.
Yeah.
All work.
Yeah, if only it was that easy, hey.
Absolutely.
And you know, it doesn't fail. It just is fascinating. In 2020, some of the questions were still being asked. You know, I was running a session for a brand you'd all be familiar with last week, and one of the very honest, genuine questions was, is it okay for women to work the night shift? And there was that moment where I thought, they're going to laugh in a minute. No, they're not laughing. It's an honest question. Okay. So that fear of going, really? Are you really asking that question in 2020? And, you know, I had a session only this week where somebody asked the question, and it's, you know, it is a question, is paedophilia classed as a sexual orientation? And, you know, it's very interesting in terms of what we're discussing in 2020. What about you?
Well, if we were playing Snap, I'd lose, because those two are classics. I'm kind of glad I haven't come across. I think the thing for us has been language, particularly around race and people feeling wary, some discomfort about what language they can use, and then trying to get the balance between actually how does your language and your deeds match up. So you can make a mistake with some of the language, but actually with your deeds is what people are left with. They're left with the feeling that, you know, of how you behaved. So we've still got some people who are, you know, saying, well, yeah, I get Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter, and we kind of enter into that discussion. We've also had people say, don't play that gender card with me. And it's like, oh, it's very, very interesting. Yeah. Very interesting concept. Well, right. and a kind of, I guess, the stuff around privilege, so white privilege, male privilege, you know, people are really grappling with those things. I think the thing that's different, though, Dawn, is the preparedness. Yes. The kind of preparedness to enter into the discussion. And I think both you and I need to kind of maintain that momentum.
Absolutely. And I think that's really key. And, you know, I've been asked to do a session this afternoon on 2021 strategy, because it's very, very different to what we would have planned at the beginning of 2020. And, you know, I hope all of the listeners are coming along to the session, but, you know, there are some fundamental changes for 2021, as we both know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Not least this stuff about flexible working, being agile, you know, working where you're from and making sure that you can enable people to work as comfortably as possible and deliver the outputs rather than measure their time. I think John's points were really great about inclusive leaders creating that environment, and we're there now.
Definitely, and that authenticity of doing it, isn't it? That's the key, and that's the key cultural change we're all looking for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I'm very conscious we said we would finish now, Louise, so that you could ask any questions we've got. I know there may have been a couple. Is there anything we can support anybody with?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that came through, actually, Dawn. There's you know, and it's really interesting to listen to you talking about, I love that phrase Loraine just used, how does your language and your deeds match up? And I think you've articulated that some of the challenge around unconscious bias training is that it's done in isolation and people think that's it. But so what else does that need to be embedded in to be useful and retained and sustained, so that people are conscious about those behaviours, even if they don't have permission to continue to display them or share them?
Sure. Shall I start, Loraine? And if we go back to the basics in terms of what we're talking about in terms of unconscious bias, you know, we're talking about the unconscious brain, and we're talking about that reactiveness of that first 8 or 9 seconds when we start to make a decision. So we know that by simply slowing our decision making down, in terms of the basics of how the cognitive brain works, we can start and become more consciously biased. So we start and recognise that our focus should be on educating around conscious bias, and we focus on understanding the difference, and we focus on what is and isn't acceptable in terms of behaviour within an organisation, and we focus on those. So we do lots of stuff around that. But the most key thing here is that we create a culture where some level of challenge or question is permissible, regardless of hierarchy, so that as we start to naturally question and challenge, all of these things start to become much more normalised. I'll stop talking, Loraine, I'll hand over to you.
No, I mean, that was great. And I guess the segue is about understanding when those conditions occur, that you're more likely to become biased. So when you're stressed, where you're pressed for time, where you've got tight deadlines, where you might have had a drink and you're deciding you want to make decisions at the end of the day, and so it's really kind of making sure that you create an environment in which actually you're going to mitigate against being unconsciously biased, but create an environment where you can, but as Dawn said, both challenge each other and make better and clearer decisions. And I think creating that time for yourself is absolutely crucial to mitigate against any kind of bias that might exist.
So it's a great answer, and there's a sort of a related question, I guess, that's come in for you. So what are the strategies and advice you would give to companies to pursue and promote more social inclusion, given that we've been talking a lot today about, we start from the place of gender with Powerful Women and all that it's trying to do, but clearly to be more truly inclusive, it's everything, right? It's all forms of diversity. So what would you promote as advice around encouraging social inclusion and making headway there?
I mean, the first thing is exactly your point, Louise, in terms of we need to be looking at this subject from an intersectionality perspective. There is so much effort and resource put into this subject, which is strand or silo focused, which if we actually just made some minor tweaks to our approaches would be naturally much more inclusive in terms of an inclusion programme. So we can start to then roll that both internally and externally to embed that intersectionality. So the kinds of things we would talk about specifically would be that affinity, would be the questioning, would be the behavioural embedding, would be the monitoring and measuring of that acceptability, and depending on how far you take this subject, right the way through to scorecard in terms of behaviour as opposed to output. That would be my view. Loraine?
I think you also have opportunities to do some really good early engagement. So if we think of the energy sector as working with STEM ambassadors as a point of interaction with schools, that's a really great way of leveling the playing field and creating more awareness about our environment, and attracting people energy sector. So that I think is really, really important. I think having ambassadors that do that outreach and having role models. I think you were talking a little bit earlier about having role models, because when people can see it, then they can believe it. That kind of image is really, really important to help with the social inclusion aspect. And then also there's your kind of corporate responsibility initiatives. They help to build that. So whether you're doing local community projects or funding large initiatives with major charities, all of those kind of actions help to create that social inclusion and cohesiveness.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I guess one final question to you both, in the context of your earlier conversation, you were talking about what a year it's been from your different perspectives. There's and bearing in mind we've got lots of people listening on the call today who are busy trying to make this happen inside their organisations and completely passionate about it, and have probably got varying degrees of leadership support in that. Some will be brilliant and some will be a work in progress. So what would you suggest, given the experience of this year, that people should think about focusing on to try and up the pace and up the ante on improving inclusion within their organisations for 2021?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a difficult question to answer in 2 minutes. Obviously, we're covering it in more detail this afternoon in terms of 10 elements that we'd strongly recommend people include in their strategies, but there are some basics. The first is intersectionality, to be focused on changing the approaches towards that. We've talked lots about measure and manage. I'm a big fan of that, appropriately. So, we set huge targets. We want 50% of our board to be women and all of this good stuff, but we don't set the KPIs of the how-tos in place. So I'm a big fan of measurable behavioural change initiatives behind that headline. So I would strongly recommend those. Things around going back to the basics. Where are you genuinely starting from, and what is vanity and PR and what is reality would be one of the things I would say quite contentiously.
No, good to focus the minds though, hey? And Loraine, what about you?
I think a build on that would be with two things really. Is really how you set your story. Why is diversity and inclusion important to your business? how does it help with the bottom line? I know for Network Rail, it's very much about our passengers. We can reflect the passengers that we serve and customers we serve. We provide a much more intelligent and robust and accessible service, and that's what we want to do. And then the other bit for underpinning that strategy is individual accountabilities. So the leadership really do need to take the initiative and to drive through the strategies that you implement. And I think those two things serve you well in terms of measuring and managing and understanding intersectionality. But I think for me, those are the things that I would hope would underpin and enable your organisation to benefit from both the discussions and then the outputs from diversity and inclusion.
That's great advice from both of you, actually, and it very nicely tees up all of the work that there is to be doing this afternoon. Once we generously give people a little lunch break before they get right back into it. So, fantastic advice and guidance and food for thought. Does the language meet the deeds? Is that authentic? I mean, there's so much demand for authentic leadership. Quite rightly, it's been long overdue in coming. It's not just about gender, it's about all forms of diversity, cognitive and otherwise, which is really important to do this well. So it is a journey and you're never probably done, quite frankly. So, there's plenty more for us to do, I guess, is the footnote to that. And I think the other salient point I heard you mention was about the new preparedness to have the conversation. And I think society is demanding that corporations have those conversations and get this. And even if they don't get it right, they learn as they go and they try by doing, and everyone feels bold enough and comfortable enough to have those conversations and go on the journey. And I think that's a massive leap forward from certainly where I've been in the last 5 years of working with powerful women, and I'm sure in the things that you've seen too. So we need to harness that acceleration, don't we, right? We need to really take hold of that so that our organisations are better as a result. Thanks to both of you for sharing some insights and some wisdom, and I know there's going to be more of that coming for the rest of the afternoon for those that are staying, so very much appreciate you giving up the time and sharing some of your expertise. But we have run a little bit over time because that advice was so good and I wanted to keep it coming, but we are going to now let you escape after some tardy timekeeping from me to go and get some lunch, which is well deserved because it's been a pacey, busy morning. For those of you that are leaving us now, thank you ever so much for joining us this morning. I hope you've enjoyed it. And as I said at the beginning, you should be feeling inspired. You should at least have 2 or 3 takeaways from what you've heard this morning, if not a longer list, I would hope. And if you haven't, get in touch and we'll see if we can work on it with you, because it's really important that we don't just talk about these things. We actually find things that we take away and do as actions to make our either first steps or additional steps on the journey. For those of you that are staying this afternoon, please take a look over lunchtime at your workshop options. Dawn's already done some good promotions for some of the stuff that's coming, and there are some trailer videos, some short videos, so you can only choose one. So watch the videos and choose carefully because you will be a little bit spoilt for choice, I can tell you. They're all going to kick off at 1:30, so I would suggest that you join the session sort of 5 minutes before or so. Just make sure that you can click on the links and get into the sessions and that you're teed up and ready to go. It's all taking place in Teams this afternoon, so we're just testing you with a bit of different technology, switching you over, but you'll be able to convene back in Hoover for the final closing plenary with Ruth at around about 10 to 3. So thank you very much indeed for your participation, all of you, and enjoy lunch. We'll see you again later on. Bye for now.